Adolf Hitler used his time in jail to dictate his political ramblings in a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, My War. He was a culture warrior. Listen to these excerpts and understand that Adolf Hitler despised the Weimar Republic and everything it stood for. He saw convincing voters as the best way of destroying the Republic from within. On propaganda. All propaganda must be popular, as its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its purely intellectual level has to be. The art of propaganda lies in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way to the attention and thus to the heart of the masses. The function of propaganda is, for example, not to weigh and ponder the rights of different people, but exclusively to emphasize the one right which it is set out to argue for. Its task is not to make an objective study of the truth, insofar as it favors the enemy, and then set it before the masses with academic fairness. Its task is to serve its own right, always and unflinchingly. On racism and the superiority of the Aryan. No more than nature decides the mating of a weaker and a stronger individuals. Even less does she desire the blending of a higher with a lower race. Since if she did, the whole work of a higher breeding over hundreds of thousands of years might be ruined with one blow. Historical experiences offer countless proofs of this. It shows with terrifying clarity that in the every mingling of Aryan blood with that of lower peoples, the result was the end of the cultured people. North America, whose population consists in by far the largest part of German elements, who mix but with little with the lower colored peoples, shows a different humanity and culture from Central and South America, where the predominantly Latin immigrants often mix with the Aborigines on a large scale. By this one example, we can clearly and distinctly recognize the effect of racial mixing. The Germanic inhabitants of the North American continent, who remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be the master of the continent. He will remain the master as long as he does not fall victim to defilement of blood. The result of all racial mixing is therefore, in brief, always the following: lowering the level of the higher race, physical and intellectual regression, and hence the beginning of the slowly but surely progressing sickness. To bring about such a development is, then, nothing else but a sin against the will of the eternal Creator. Everything we admire on this earth today, science, art, technology, and innovation, is only the creative product of a few people and originally, perhaps, of one race. On them depends the existence of the whole culture. If they perish, the beauty of this earth will sink into the grave with them. If we divide mankind into three groups, the founders of culture, the bearers of culture, the destroyers of culture, only the Aryan can be considered as the representative of the first group. From him originate the foundation and walls of all human creation. The mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jew. The Jewish people, despite all apparent intellectual qualities, is without a true culture, and especially without any culture of its own. For what sham culture the Jews today possess is the property of other peoples, and for the most part is ruined in their hands. On the first and greatest lie, that the Jews are not a race but a religion, more and more lies are based in necessary consequence. Among them is the lie with regard to the language of the Jew. For him it is not a means of expressing his thoughts, but a means for concealing them. When he speaks French, he thinks Jewish, and while he turns out German verses, in his life he only expresses the nature of his nationality. As long as the Jew has not become the master of other peoples, he must speak their language whether he likes it or not, but as soon as they become his slaves, they would all have to learn a universal language. With satanic joy in his face, the black-haired youth lurks in wait for the unsuspecting girl whom he defiles with his blood, thus stealing from her people. With every means, he tries to destroy the racial foundations of the people he is set out to subjugate. The propaganda, then, that Hitler promoted was a propaganda of racism. It was a very simple, compelling, and emotional story. The Germans were victims to Jews. Every attempt of Germans to reconcile, debate, discuss with Jews would fail. The only solution was the separation of the races. Adolf Hitler found his model in the southern part of the United States that advocated segregation. When the African Americans became free at the end of the Civil War, Southerners imposed segregation, laws preventing the mixing of the races. Adolf Hitler saw that as the only path to saving German greatness and restoring its nation to the rightful place at the top of the food chain. He linked his racial message with an economic message of destruction from communism. Karl Marx was a Jew. That meant all Jews were communist and all the Jews were behind the Bolshevik Revolution and set out to destroy Germany. And so the Jew today is the great agitator for the destruction of Germany. Wherever in the world we read of attacks against Germany, the Jews are their fabricators. Just as in peacetime and during the war, the press of the Jewish Stock Exchange and the Marxists systematically stirred up hatred against Germany, until state after state abandoned neutrality and renouncing the true interest of the peoples. The Jewish train of thought in all this is clear. The Bolshevization of Germany, that is, to make possible the swearing of the German working class under the yoke of the Jewish world finance, which is conceived only as preliminary to the further extension of this Jewish tendency of world conquest. As often in history, Germany is the great pivot in the mighty struggle. If our people in our state become the victim of this bloodthirsty and vicious Jewish tyrants of nations, the whole earth will sink into the snares of this octopus. If Germany frees herself from this embrace, this greatest of dangers to nation may be regarded as broken for the whole world. Hitler shouted from the mountaintops about a Jewish world conspiracy that was set for world domination. Only the Aryans stood in their way. Adolf Hitler wanted to rile the German people up against the Jewish conspiracy of liberalism, democracy, communism, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the liberation of women. All of the aspects of the modern world came from a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the Aryan people and to seek world domination. Hitler's propaganda meant to stop all that. What did it mean for Germany's future? The future rested with Lebensraum, living space. Germany needed the space to live. If the National Socialist movement really wants to be consecrated in history, with the greatest mission for our nation, it must be permeated by the knowledge and filled with the pain at our true situation in the world, boldly and consciously of its goal. It must take up the struggle against aimless and incompetence which has hitherto guided our German nation in the line of foreign affairs. Thus, without consideration of tradition and prejudice, it must find the courage to gather our people and strength for an advance along the road that will lead this people from the present restricted living space to new land and soil, and hence also free it from the danger of vanishing from the face of the earth or serving others as a slave nation. The the National Socialist movement must strive to eliminate the disproportion between our population and our area, viewing the latter as a source of food as well as the basis for power politics, between our historical past and our hopelessness of our present incompetence. The demand for the restoration of the frontiers of 1914 is a political absurdity of such proportion and consequences as to make it seem a crime, quite aside from the fact that the rights frontiers in 1914 were anything but logical. For in reality, they were neither complete in the sense of embracing all the peoples of German nationality, or sensible with regard to geo-military expediency. As opposed to this, we, National Socialists, must hold unflinchingly to our aim in foreign affairs, namely, to secure for the German people the land and soil in which they are entitled on this earth. And this action is the only one which before God and our German posterity would make any sacrifice of blood seem justified. Just as our ancestors did not receive the soil on which we live today as a gift from heaven, but had to fight for it at the risk of their lives, in the future no folkish grace will win soil for us and hence life for our people, but only the might of a vicious sword. Struggle, war, fight, those bring life. Compromise, talk, debate, respect, toleration, those invite death. Adolf Hitler hated the Weimar Republic, he hated the socialist, he hated the communist. His goal was to establish a new Reich, a Third Reich, based on blood and iron, just as German ancestors did in his mythology. When Adolf Hitler got out of jail and took his message to voters, only a limited number responded to this message in 1928. Out of the millions of voters who went to the polls, he only garnered 810,000 votes. That was a definite minority. German voters preferred both the socialist and normal nationalist over the Nazis. They were not going to listen to this message at that time. In 1929, when the United States stock market crashed, bringing down the world economy with it, Adolf Hitler revisited and shouted louder his conspiracy against Jews. Jews on Wall Street, Jews in the communist movement, were all setting about to destroy traditional European society. The Jews were trying to take down the Aryan race. That message resonated as more and more Germans found themselves unemployed. The German unemployment rate rose to 30%. In some of the major cities, it was high as 80% in trades. Heinrich Brüning, just like Herbert Hoover in the United States, responded to the Great Depression by cutting spending. Their goal was retrenchment. Brüning actually invoked Article 48, giving himself emergency powers, suspending right of freedom of speech, suspending rights of a fair trial. He was going to meet social anxiety with an iron fist. Brüning, like Hoover, was not willing to listen to a man like Keynes, who called for aggregate demand, calling for the government to spend money, borrow money in the face of the Depression and put people to work. Putting people to work would prime the pump, jump-starting the economy. Instead, Brüning sought a balanced budget, believing that taking on more debt at this time of economic distress would only weaken the position of the government. He was dead wrong. Brüning then sought a popular mandate. He wanted to strengthen his position in government, and so he dissolved Parliament, called for a new election in 1930. This time, the Nazis got 6.4 million out of 35 million votes. They were on the rise. Instead of strengthening his position, Brüning actually weakened his position. German conservatives were not prepared to take on the challenges of the Great Depression. And so, just like in the United States, the Great Depression lingered on, unemployment continued to fester, and social unrest became the norm. By the time the election of November 1932 rolled around, Adolf Hitler had 3 years of scapegoating. Scapegoating the Treaty of Versailles, scapegoating foreigners, but most of all, scapegoating Jews. There was a worldwide conspiracy of Jews trying to bring down the Aryan race. Only the Nazis could protect Germany and the world from this scourge of Jewish tyranny. Adolf Hitler was defending the freedom of the Aryans. Adolf Hitler's message then resonated. In 1932, the Nazis got 43.9% of the vote, getting 288 seats in the Reichstag. Those 288 seats, with the nationalists, gave the Nazis the power to form a government. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Voters in Germany turned against their republic and chose to follow an authoritarian leader promising racism, war, and the defense of Germany against all enemies, foreign and domestic.